Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. I'm joined by managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage, who is in Chicago as we speak. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Peggy.
We invite you, our listeners, to show your support for Mormon Land by going to patreon.com, where with a donation as little as $3 a month, you can access all of the Tribune's religion coverage, transcripts to our podcasts, and the Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormon Land. Now for today's episode. Carolyn Homer, a Latter-day Saint attorney in Washington, D.C., expected her life to be the epitome of Mormonism's teachings on marriage and family. She planned for a temple wedding and didn't expect to work outside the home after children were born. But that marriage failed and thrust her into a new spiritual journey. Now married to a Catholic and as a relatively new mother, Carolyn and her husband, Brad, are charting a rich path with both faiths. She joins us today via Zoom to talk about her experience with divorce, marriage, and interfaith parenting. Carolyn, welcome.
Welcome. It's great to be here.
So tell us, what were your beliefs about marriage in the temple growing up?
Oh, I was the quintessential Mormon girl who went to every EFY, which I think is now called FSY. I went to every youth conference. I had close to 100% attendance at seminary. Like I believed it all, and I still believe a lot of it. But you know, the highest purpose of a woman was to get married and to have kids and to raise those kids. You know, she wasn't supposed to work outside the home because you have this divine calling as a mother. You get married in the temple to be sealed for all eternity with your family. You should give up any sort of relationship that's not with a Mormon or not with a righteous enough priesthood holder in order to pursue the blessings of eternal sealing. Like, absolutely, those were kind of foundational core beliefs to my identity and my religious journey.
So what caused those to change?
Well, I mean, growing up, reality. But for me, the biggest part was like a failed first marriage. So I did get married in the temple in 2012, so a little more than 10 years ago. And the marriage was just a disaster. Like, from the earliest days, it was not going well. And I had to go through this huge faith realignment where everything I had expected was supposed to happen wasn't happening. I mean, sometimes I was like getting answers to prayers that were directly contradictory to like what my husband was telling me to do. And I literally thought that wasn't possible to happen. Like, I had thought he would be the priesthood spiritual leader of the home, and I had to defer to whatever his spiritual wisdom was. And so when we started having fights and like my deeply held belief or spiritual prompting would be different from what his was, I didn't know how to reconcile that. And it took an enormous amount of prayer and research to start to realize eventually that divorce was an okay option.
So, Carolyn, how did the decision to pursue the divorce affect your faith itself?
Well, I often tell people that like the divorce was tied up with becoming a Mormon feminist. So, you know, I had just gotten married when I really discovered all of the then very popular Mormon blogs. So By Common Consent and Feminist Mormon Housewives and Exponent 2. And I just started reading everything I could get my hands on. And I remember having this sense early on that I agreed with maybe 25% of their points, but the other 75% was like intellectually interesting enough that I wanted to just keep reading in order to empathize with people. And as I was getting started in my career and my marriage was going south, I just very quickly, over the course of about a year, started agreeing with 90% of what they were saying. And it was just this massive shift of, I mean, I just remember I finally had words for things like patriarchy and consent and privilege. And like there was like this whole universe of language that I had never understood. There was an entire concept that's very popular at the time called like radical self-respect. And it was just this idea that you have divine worth and Jesus loves you for exactly who you are. And like recognizing the value you have as a person actually enables you to set better boundaries and say no when work or church or life or relationships are mistreating that or taking advantage of that. Like these were all radical concepts to me that I wasn't in a world where I had to constantly seek permission from men or permission from people in authority in order to follow Jesus Christ and to live what made me happiest.
Did you ever think about leaving the church over this?
Good question. Yes. Yes. I will say the closest I probably ever came to really seriously thinking about just leaving completely was after the November 5th policy change about whether the children of LGBTQ parents could be baptized. I have never been more upset at that point because like I had always kind of been able to thread the needle and say, oh, some people's experiences at church are different. But my experience with church overall had always been phenomenal. My ward was phenomenal. I felt like I had this incredible family, this incredible opportunity for service. And so even when some things went wrong or I had some doctrinal disagreements, I would just kind of cling to that core ward family. And when that happened, I was like, I'm not sure I can continue to support this institution that would do that to children. I ultimately stayed in part because I felt like those children needed people who loved them at church too. Like the children are still there. And then I was extremely grateful when a few years later the policy was reversed.
Right. Let's fast forward a little bit. Tell us about how you met Brad, your second husband.
Well, I actually met my second husband before I married my first husband.
Really?
This is a really funny story that I could spend hours on, but I will give the 2-paragraph version. So Brad and I in 2005 were actually in the same undergrad program together at Indiana University. And we met at a semester kickoff barbecue and like hung out and bantered all night and went to a soccer game. I discovered he had been like a state championship soccer goalie in high school. And so we were just like totally bantering. We ended up dating in undergrad and the only thing we fought over was religion. And so we were both very sincerely trying to convert the other person because we both had the belief that we had to marry within our faith in order to have a successful, happy relationship. And ultimately, about 4 years later, at the end of undergrad, beginning of law school, for both of us, we broke up because we realized there was like either we were going to say religion didn't matter and get married, or we had to break up. And I remember like locking myself in a walk-in closet for 3 hours, pleading with God for a solution to this problem, and ultimately telling God, like, I love you and I love the commitments I've made to the temple more than I love Brad, and I'm going to break up with him. So I did. And we didn't speak again for 6 years. It was too painful to talk to him. I met a Mormon. I married a Mormon. I divorced a Mormon. He actually married a Catholic and divorced a Catholic. And we found out from a mutual best friend from college that we both had left our ex-spouses within a month of each other. And we reconnected in 2015. And I mean, that's where you say the rest is history. Like we spent a year becoming friends again and getting to know each other again. And we were like pre-negotiating a relationship. We were starting to be like, if we decided to date again, what religion would we raise our future children?
Because that was the point of contention. So how did you ultimately get past that? Did you just have a lawyer-to-lawyer negotiation there?
Yeah, basically. I mean, I think we both had done a lot of growing up from when we had broken up at the age of 22 to when we got back together around the age of 30 and had failed marriages in the middle there. It was a fun year as we talked to each other and realized like we both had grown up, but in the same way. Because, and I think for me at least, one of the consequences of a bad temple marriage is I just really struggled with the temple. I just don't have a testimony of the temple. There was a lot about this church I love, but I had concluded that was just not going to be a part of my worship going forward because it was too painful for me for a long list of reasons we could get into. And so as soon as I cut that out, it was, well, what do I really want? I want to be with someone who's kind and who worships Jesus and who will have children who worship Jesus. And that is our top priority, right? Is kindness in Christ. And that's easy with a Catholic to focus on kindness and Jesus Christ. And so since there's no expectation that our future children will go to the temple, because I frankly, I would recommend against it at this point without more significant changes. That means I'm not expecting them to go on a mission. I'm not expecting them to go to BYU. I'm not expecting them to have a temple wedding, like all the sorts of things that I was more or less expected to do. And that just opens up a lot of opportunities for us to focus on everything about Christianity we have in common and not so much the differences.
So you had to get a temple divorce, I'm presuming. And obviously, if he was divorced, he had to get some kind of annulment. Like those are hard things.
Yes.
How do you guys navigate that?
Yeah, so I actually I'll start with the temple sealing cancellation. So technically, I didn't have to get one because I wasn't seeking to remarry in the temple, right? So I could have just gotten a civil divorce and gone on my way. And I don't think the LDS church necessarily would have cared unless, my husband converted and I was seeking to get sealed later. But I wanted one just because I wanted my religious marital status to track my civil marital status, just like it had tracked it when I got married. And I will just give the church full credit. My understanding is all hearsay, but my understanding is about 10 years ago, the first presidency realized that they used to have a policy that women weren't eligible for a cancellation unless they were engaged to a worthy priesthood holder planning a temple wedding, and they would just deny them outright at that time. And I have many, many friends who had their cancellations denied. And my understanding is there was essentially a change at church headquarters that if somebody was asking, especially a woman was asking for a cancellation, there was probably a good reason, and the default was going to be to say yes. So my bishop, my stake president were great. We submitted all the paperwork, and within 3 weeks, I had a cancellation letter. So my process from Salt Lake was phenomenal. I have no complaints about that. The Catholic annulment process is much harder. There's a little bit, we call it bishop roulette sometimes in the church, about how different jurisdictions have slightly different rules and slightly different barriers because people are imperfect and human. So there's priest roulette in the Catholic Church that is the same problem. And my husband is in one of the more conservative dioceses in the area. And so they have some extra hurdles. It could be a little harder to get an annulment in Northern Virginia than in other parts of the country. But yeah, it's like a 9-month-long process. It was tons of paperwork. I don't even remember all the details, but it was a long process. So he gets an annulment from his ex. And then interesting things happen. So we get engaged after I have a cancellation and he has an annulment. I think we've been dating for 2 years at that point. And we go to a priest to set a wedding date and get told this very complicated aspect of canon law, which is about 15 years earlier than that. So this is Pope Benedict era. The Vatican had some sort of council that one of the topics under discussion was the validity of other Christian churches' baptisms. And that council had concluded that the LDS church resembles what's known as the Arian controversy of the 4th century, but basically that our definition of what we call the Godhead wasn't Trinitarian enough based on the Catholic definition of the Trinity, and therefore all of our baptisms were invalid because we weren't actually Christian. And this comes with a whole bunch of complications, but the gist of it is, instead of seeking to marry a fellow Christian who just didn't have a complete understanding of Catholic doctrine, which is one class under Catholic canon law, my husband was trying to marry a heretic. And trying to marry a heretic requires a whole different set of procedures and rules, the gist of which was that the Catholic Church also had to annul my Mormon marriage. Like, so they recognized the validity of my Mormon marriage, but they didn't recognize the validity of my Mormon sealing cancellation. That isn't an annulment to them. So I had to get an annulment from the Catholic Church, which they would only grant if I also promised to raise our future children Catholic, because they have this provision in canon law it's literally called a privilege in favor of the faith. And this, instead of being able to be granted by a local priest in diocese, had to go straight to the Vatican. So we had to wait another 18 months for us to get a letter in Latin from the Vatican giving Brad permission to marry me as a divorced heretic, or else he would have been excommunicated.
Wow. So eventually you did get permission to do it.
Well, how? Because you got married in a Catholic church, right?
Yes.
Okay, so how was that? Did your Latter-day Saint family intend, and what did they think?
Yeah, my family's amazing. So my mom in particular has been like in local leadership in various interfaith councils for decades in Indiana, where I grew up. And like I was a religious studies major in college. One of my sisters was a religious studies major. We have always just had a family attitude that religion inherently is beautiful, and every religion is interesting and has truth and has, just like Gordon B. Hinckley used to say, like, bring us all of the good you have and see if we can add to it. Like that, we were always looking for the good in other faiths. And so my parents, I mean, there was some disappointment that I had not found a Mormon second husband or that Brad wasn't converting, but it was never something that like fundamentally threatened my relationship with my family or made them think they would like boycott the wedding or anything like that. No, they absolutely came. My dad walked me down the aisle. My mom went home to her Catholic friends on the Interfaith Council and bragged about the interfaith wedding and how gorgeous the Basilica in Alexandria, Virginia was. And it really was lovely.
What about his family? It's Mormon heretic.
I will say it's funny. When we dated in college, his family was very concerned about him dating a Mormon heretic. I think after he also had a failed marriage, that they've always been very welcoming to me. And the sense I got is they realize I'm a nice person who loves Jesus, and they just want their son to be happy. So I'm sure if they were on the podcast and I asked them this direct of a question, they might start expressing concerns about, the pagan mythological roots of whatever anti-Mormon literature they've read. But it's never been a problem at like Thanksgiving or anything.
So now you have a young child, David, and somehow you came up with the idea that he would be reared 66% Catholic and 33% Mormon. How does that work? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean,
now, what's the other 1%? That's the other thing I was wondering.
So. It's rounding. Fine, we'll give the extra 1% to the LDS Church. He'll be 34% LDS.
Okay.
The 2/3, 1/3 is what I was trying to capture there. So this relates to my bit of a feminist Mormon faith crisis, where I just said we're just cutting out the temple from this dialogue, right? So that was sort of the starting point. And then, so the agreement we reached is David is baptized Catholic and will have First Communion as a Catholic. And then as you get to like the confirmation era, which is 12, 13, 14, like by that point, I'm just assuming he's going to be a willfully stubborn, strong-minded kid of his own, and he's going to make his own choices. And so my husband and I, Brad, we've just acknowledged that that's going to happen. Like, and our biggest hope is just that our children, with the hypothetical plural, just want to follow Jesus Christ and are nice people, right? So we fully recognize there's only so much we can control there. But, in the abstract, the idea was the core religious rituals are all going to be Catholic, but the LDS Church is just frankly better about the sort of social community aspects than the Catholic Church in our area. Certainly, David loves nursery. Nursery is way more fun than sitting in pews at our Catholic service that doesn't really have a children's mass. I think there are some services, but it's just not as integrated as the LDS Church is. And I am more extroverted than my husband, so I am always going to have my Mormon friends around and playing. Brad has no objection to Book of Mormon stories being told. He thinks they teach great moral lessons. And so that's just sort of the sense is David goes to both churches. At the moment, he's getting more social interaction from the Mormon Church, and Brad wants him fully conversant with the culture and the history and the scriptures and the stories and the role models that he can get there. But his core identity, as directed by his parents until he can choose otherwise, is Catholic.
So he had an infant baptism in the Catholic Church, but also a baby blessing in the LDS Church. How'd that work?
Yes. Yeah, so my dad blessed him in the Mormon Church. Well, and this was, we just had like a theological conversation about it, is, baby blessings they're like a welcome to the church, welcome to the community, family sort of ordinance. They're not a quote unquote sacrament or what the LDS Church would call a saving ordinance. Like they're not officially part of the covenant path as now defined. And so Brad's view was having more people pray for the health and well-being of his child and be invested in that community can only be a good thing. And because it's not like the replication of what he considers to be a core sacrament, then it's fine. So where we have, I guess, the most complicated discussions are on things like baptism and the Eucharist.
What have you decided about the sacrament, the Mormon sacrament?
Yeah, this has actually been an ongoing discussion lately because David's about 1.5, and he's reached the age like where he wants to grab bread out of the sacrament tray as it goes by because it's a snack and he's hungry. And so I had a long conversation. It's been like ongoing for several weeks now at this point with my husband, which is basically, do we let David grab the bread because it's meaningless to him and it's a snack, or do I stop him from doing so? And then that led to a conversation about, well, what even is the Mormon theology of the sacrament? Because, like, I know my friend Jonathan Stapley has written about this, but when I started comparing it with my other friends, like, our understanding of sacrament theology is kind of confusing because we say, the way I learned it growing up was that the sacrament was more or less meaningless until you were 8 years old and were baptized. And then every week thereafter, partaking of the sacrament was essentially an infusion of the grace of Christ that renewed your sacrament or your baptismal covenants. And so I was kind of explaining that to Brad as I was like, well, even within the LDS faith tradition, this would be meaningless if David took it because he lacks the sinful nature or repentant intent for it to actually have this like efficacious power. And my husband was like, well, that's an argument in favor of not taking it, not an argument in favor of taking it. Because like, if you're saying it's meaningless, then he doesn't need to take it. And if you're saying it's meaningless, that actually furthers the point that, in my view, it's, I think how way to describe this, but like theologically impure or like a knockoff Eucharist, like that to him, it's pretending to be something of spiritual value while not having it. It's like mimicking the value of the Eucharist, but he very, very sincerely believes like in the salvific power of the Eucharist itself. And so he doesn't want his child like learning a fake sacrament, in his view, when he will be doing First Communion for a real sacrament when he's 8 in the Catholic Church. So, I mean, I was like, that's a fair point. And so I'm doing my best to stop the toddler. Though I will say it was funny this week. We had a new variation on this conversation because we were sitting next to a teenage girl who had babysat David the weekend before. And she had baked the bread that turned into the sacrament bread. Our ward has young women do that sometimes. And so at the end of the sacrament, somebody brought her the other half of the unused loaf of bread, and she started feeding that to David. And then I was like, wait, okay, hold on. This bread is of one form and substance with the sacrament bread, but this was not the bread that was used. Is this a problem? And my husband just started laughing and said, well, but this portion of bread wasn't consecrated, so it's not a fake sacrament. It's just bread. And,
wow.
Those are the conversations we have in our house, like every Sunday.
And then there's the practical reality, Carolyn, of not letting him have what he sees as a snack right now and pass by, right? Right. So I was just going to ask you, because conflicts are inevitably going to come up over these things. And I was going to ask you how you resolve them. I think we're getting a hint of how you do it now, right? Which is a lot of conversation and discussion, right?
Yeah. I mean, I told my mother at one point when she did ask the question, like, why are you marrying a Catholic instead of trying a Mormon singles ward again? That was a quote. I said, because I've never met anyone better at conflict resolution than Brad. And after a failed marriage, like, there's literally nothing I want more than somebody who's going to approach every single conflict from a place of kindness and assuming the best about the person they're talking to. And like, that is the foundation of our marriage, is that we can talk through absolutely everything without getting angry or slamming doors or storming off. So all of these conversations, like, kind of the more theologically rich it gets, the more engaged we get, the more we make fun of it, the more we crack jokes, the more, I don't know. So far, we've always been able to get somewhere. I mean, even on like the Book of Mormon, like, I was worried that we wouldn't tell Book of Mormon stories. And Brad read the Book of Mormon when I asked him to, and he just sort of reached the conclusion. He's like, this is New Testament fan fiction. He's like, I don't think it's real. Like, he's like, I don't think this is a true story, or I wouldn't necessarily call it scripture, but there's also nothing in here that as a Christian I have a problem with. So if we're going to use this to teach moral lessons about charity and kindness and repentance and whatever else you can say the Book of Mormon teaches, then he's fine with it.
So it sounds like pretty ideal situation, but would you recommend other Latter-day Saints marry outside the church, or do you think your situation is kind of a unicorn and only the two of you could make this work? What do you think?
I don't think we're a unicorn. I think a lot of the absolutist, theological positions that at least I grew up with in the 90s in the LDS church, and I certainly know other people have grown up with, do people a disservice, right? Like, and not, I have so many friends who, they will have gotten married in a very, very happy, successful temple marriage. And 15 years later, one of the members of the marriage loses their testimony or doesn't want to affiliate with the Mormon church anymore. And every week in various LDS forums I'm on social media, I watch questions explode with basically, my husband wants out of the church. Does that mean I need to divorce him? Does that mean my temple sealing is over? Does that mean, what does that mean for my eternal family? And it's just like this incredible level of angst. And that just makes me sad, because he's still the same person and he still loves you. And for a lot of these people, like, they're leaving the Mormon church, or they're struggling with the Mormon church precisely because of the deeply rooted convictions of following Christ they learned from that church. They're prioritizing loving their neighbor or loving their LGBT children, or like there's something that's happened that's caused their personal faith to break with what the institutional church is teaching them. But it often is genuinely from a place of love and not a place of bitterness. And so thinking that just because you suddenly have a mixed faith family, that means your eternal marriage is over, I just find that so sad. It's there's one Mormon blogger who calls it this vision of sad heaven, that somehow, because we believe so much in sealing, the flip side of that is that anytime a family starts to fracture, that's like a condemnation of the whole family. And I just don't think that's what our theology is intended to capture, right? Our theology is meant to bring families together, not be used as a cudgel to divide them. And I don't know what the answer is going to be in the future, but I just can't imagine a world in which two people who genuinely love each other and are trying to be loving and do the best with the information they have are going to be separated for all eternity because they stopped following some rule that they found irreconcilably in conflict with some deeper religious belief. So I didn't actually answer your original question about like, I guess that's I don't advise people to get divorced if a faith thing breaks out later, if there's a difference that arises later. But certainly when you're in your 20s, and I spent a fair amount of time in singles wards, and it's been a while now, but the women always outnumbered the men 2-1. And that was just like a realistic statistic. And whenever we would point out that statistic to visiting general authorities, you would get variations on either be faithful or flirt to convert. And as somebody who tried to flirt to convert my now husband for 4 years in undergrad and failed resoundingly, I'd spent so much time locked in closets having angst about that. I think I just came to realize, like, we also believe in agency, and like praying to fundamentally change the religious beliefs of somebody else who, frankly, you want to have deep convicted religious beliefs that don't just change because a cute girl is in the picture, like is a disservice to them. And the more realistic conflicts I have, when friends call me about being in an interfaith marriage, their first question is like sex. Like, how do you handle the law of chastity when you're dating a non-member? And so I could spend hours on that. But in general, I think like you can find someone who respects you and respects your values, and it doesn't have to be within the faith as you grew up in. Certainly, if that's your highest priority, go pursue it. I understand exactly where that comes from, and I certainly held those beliefs for decades. But as someone who now is in a mixed faith marriage and we both happily attend each other's churches, like there's a lot of joy here too.
So, Carolyn, as we wrap up, has your mixed faith marriage enriched your own Latter-day Saints faith and LDS faith and spiritual journey? If so, how has it done that?
As I said earlier, I was a religion major in college, so every time I dabble with any other religious community, it always increases my own faith. I sometimes tell people that like I feel like communities tend to like glom around the same 50 stories that help build your community. And whenever I just sort of parachute into a different faith community and start hearing their variations of the 50 stories, like it just dramatically enriches my life and my relationship with God to just hear different people of faith talking about their personal experiences. And so, yeah, I absolutely would say all of the attendance in Catholic ceremonies. I mean, one example, right, is like Christmas, Easter. The LDS Church, for whatever reason, we've been trying to improve in recent years, but we're just not good at the pomp and circumstance of Christmas and Easter, which makes sense. We are a frontier faith with our biggest influences from American West Methodism, who is like a low church Protestantism. Like, of course, we have relatively plain, unadorned chapels and relatively plain, unadorned music. But there is just something absolutely beautiful of going to like a midnight mass at a Catholic church, with a candlelight service and the organs and the trumpets and the harps and the garlands everywhere. And, they've been doing it this way for 1,500 years, and the beauty of the tradition just comes through. And so I certainly feel like these like high holy day type experience. That's an inapt term. I apologize to my Jewish friends. These what is the Catholic phrase? Holy days of obligation, I think. But like the critical religious celebrations, Catholic Church does a lot better, and I certainly learn a lot from the depth of that tradition.
Carolyn Homer, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. This is fun.
And thanks to Dave Noyce.
Thanks, Peggy, and go Cubs.
And to our producers, Nicole Weaver and Theodora Soder. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to slstrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.